I hope you survived the previous section. There's a lot of really important stuff in there. Maybe take a break before moving on to this one. I don't really have a real title for this section. I'm calling it Committing in More Detail, but it's more than that. This section does cover some more stuff around committing, but also there are some assorted Git topics thrown in here that didn't really fit anywhere else neatly. So let's talk about what actually matters. We're going to talk about something called atomic commits, writing atomic commits. That sounds scarier than it is. It's just an approach as to how you break down commits. We'll say it's important, but I wouldn't stress about it, not critical. If you're on a Windows machine, when we installed Git, we also configured VS Code to be the default editor. If you're on a Mac, that was not part of the installation process. It didn't prompt us for that. So if you're on a Mac, it's going to be important to configure the default editor, and I use VS Code. I'll show you how to do that. If you're not on a Mac, you probably already did it. Okay, working with a graphical user interface. I like showing it. A lot of students enjoy it, but 100% optional, not essential to using Git. It's one option, but you could go your whole life without ever touching a GUI. Amending commits, we'll say, is nice to have. It's useful, but especially early on, not that common that you would need this. Now, git ignore, I'll say, is a pretty critical part of working with Git. Still early on, not a big deal. But when you work with Git in the real world, git ignores are very important. I haven't even explained what it is, but just trust me, that's critical. Writing good commit messages, we'll say, is important, but again, not like a fundamental thing, more of a matter of taste and opinion. And then navigating the Git documentation, we'll say important as well, but not critical. I'm not really a big fan of the Git docs, honestly. They're very intimidating. So as you can see, it's kind of a mixed bag here. There are some nice to haves that I still recommend watching, but amending commits, for example, working with a GUI, I don't think they're all that important. But working with git ignores, and then some good practices for writing commits, writing atomic commits, writing good commit messages, worth your time, but don't freak out about it. So let's get started. So let's start this section off with a nice and easy topic, the Git docs. Yes, this is a very funny joke because these are pictures of doctors, but we're not actually talking about doctors. We're talking about the Git documentation. Can you believe how funny that is? So dumb jokes aside, we're talking about the Git documentation, which you may want to reference at some point if you have questions or you want to learn more about one of the commands that I'm showing you. So the docs are accessible at git-scm.com. I never remember that. I just Google Git, and then I end up on this webpage. And then we want to go to documentation pretty much every time. That's where I go. I'm not going to about. I don't need to see the advantages of Git to compare it to something else. I'm already using it. I just want the docs. Now, there are a couple of sections here, and most of the time I end up looking at the reference manual. Occasionally this book called Pro Git, pretty much never the videos. So the reference manual, we'll start there, is exactly what it says. It's a reference manual to all the Git commands and main topics. It is not ordered. It's not a step-by-step guide. It's just a reference. So for example, we've been using git commit. If I want to learn more about git commit, I can click on this. I'll zoom in. It tells us roughly what it does. Record changes to the repository. Here's a more detailed description. But then, as I scroll down, this is what I end up looking at occasionally on the docs, all of these options. So this is one command, git commit. And we've used one option, which is -m. You could find that on here somewhere. -m, which is short for -- message. Use the given message as the commit message. We already know that. Hopefully you know how to do that. But here's where we would find that information. So there are lots of options for every single one of the Git commands I've shown you, and it's honestly overwhelming. I use very few of them, but there are a lot available. So if you ever have questions about them, if you see somebody use a command, git commit, and then the -z flag, and you have no idea what that is, you can read about it here. Also, if we keep scrolling down, we will find examples. So there are some examples that show, how to use git commit in this example. But on, another page, if we're looking at git log, there will be examples for git log, or for some of the more advanced commands that can be helpful. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there's discussion down at the bottom. Basically, for every git command, we deal with this really thorough but also intimidating set of documentation. So if you are looking for something more educational or more sort of teachy, you can go to the book. And this is grouped into topics that are ordered, and it explains things. So for example, we haven't yet covered branching, but if you wanted to learn more about branching, or if my explanation is insufficient, once you get to that section, you can read more and have diagrams and sort of step-by-step explanation here. And it's pretty well, I shouldn't say pretty, it's very well written. It's a well done book, and it is a nice antidote to the dry and, purely reference manual documentation. The book really does have a clear path through it. So I don't necessarily recommend reading the entire book, but I mean, if I come here occasionally when I have questions about things, some commands that I haven't used in a while, or configuring things, the book is very helpful to explain them. And then if you just have a one-off question about what is that flag, or is there a way to do X with the git log command, you can go read about it on the reference manual. Just do your best to stay sane while reading these docs. There's so many options, so many flags for every single command. All right, so that's how we get to the docs: git-scm.com, documentation, reference manual, or book. One of the more common pieces of Git advice that many a blog article has been written about is to keep your commits atomic. So what does that mean? That's what I want to talk about in this video, and I'll show you an example. In this context, the word atomic does not mean, having to do with an atom, but rather of something being irreducible, or of a base unit, a single component that makes up a larger system. So if that doesn't mean anything to you, just read the first paragraph here. When possible, your commits should encompass a single feature, a single change, a fix. In other words, try and keep each commit focused on a single thing. And this is important, especially if you're working with code and you're writing code, you're adding features or fixing bugs. It's super important to keep things as atomic as possible, to keep each commit focused on one thing. Again, that does not mean one file. That means one feature, one thing that you worked on. So let me show you an example. Here, I've got my first novel repository going still, and I'm going to do two things this morning. First of all, I'm going to add some inspiration, some visual inspiration. Since I'm such a budding writer, I want to have a little mood board. So I've actually downloaded a couple of photos that I want to use, just 1920s-esque photos. This is the best I could find with all the copyright restrictions I have to worry about. So I'm going to make a new folder in here. I'll just do it through Finder. I'll call it Mood Board. And then I'm just going to put those images in there. Okay, so now I have that folder in there. And of course, if I type git status, Git is going to tell me, hey, there's a whole new directory, mood board, that I see, but I'm not tracking. So I keep working on my novel, and I decide, I'm not sure if I like the name Gatsby. I think I want to change Gatsby to be Catsby with a C. So I'm going to change that across all my files. How am I going to do that? Well, with VS Code, it's super simple. If I go to this little icon here, there's also a shortcut I can never remember. I can search for Gatsby, and I can replace it across all files. So it found it in 4 different files, right? The characters file, chapter 1, chapter 2, the outline, and I'll replace it with Catsby, like that. And then I can click this button. However you do this, if you are following along, I'm just making a change across a bunch of files. So it's asking me, are you sure you want to replace 18 occurrences across 4 files? Sure. All right, so now we see it changed here. Catsby in the characters file, somewhere in here, I'm sure. Here we go. When I looked once more for Catsby, he had vanished. So we can trust that it changed across all those files. So now I'm ready to start committing. It's later in the day, or maybe I'm going to take a lunch break. So I type git status, and we have a couple of things, right? We have 4 files that have been modified, plus a whole new directory that contains a bunch of files inside, 3 image files. So I'm not just going to add all of this to one single commit. That breaks this rule or this pattern of wanting to keep each commit focused on a single thing. here, it's very easy for me to break this up and just say, okay, my first commit, the order doesn't really matter, but one commit I'll make will be around changing Gatsby to Catsby. That was one thing that I did. And then the other commit that I'll make will be around adding to my mood board or creating my mood board. So why don't I start by just adding chapter 1 and chapter 2 and the characters and outline. So notice I did not do git add dots because I don't want the mood board. So now if I type git status, I've got these 4 things staged for my next commit, and now I'm going to commit. So git commit, and those 4 files, those 4 changes, they all had to do with changing Gatsby to Catsby. So I'd go with, replace Gatsby, or how about rename Gatsby to Catsby. Okay, I type git status, and we still have some uncommitted changes, some stuff I've worked on that Git does not know about. It's a whole directory, that's what the slash means. So if I wanted to, I could add specific files from inside of there, git add moodboard /, and then I could type the name of one of those files, like Rolls, it's a Rolls-Royce image. So I could do it that way, or I can just add the entire directory like this. And I'll just add the entire thing. Now if I type git status, you can see all 3 image files have been added. They are going to be committed whenever I commit. So I'll commit now, git commit -m, what should I do? How about start off or create mood board? Sure, create mood board. There we go. So I just made 2 separate commits instead of one larger commit, following this idea, keeping our commits atomic, breaking them down into some sort of single irreducible unit or piece, instead of having like a multi-purpose commit that just includes everything you did at once. Break it down into smaller pieces. This matters a lot when you're working on code, especially when you're working with a team of people, and you may need to undo some of the things that you write. You may introduce a bug at some point, and if you boiled in a whole bunch of changes into one commit, rolling back that commit could undo a ton of work. But if you kept your commits atomic, single purpose, then if somebody needs to undo one of them, you don't lose all that other work. It also makes your code easier to review if you do, or when you do code reviews. It's just generally a practice you want to follow. Group things together in a way that makes sense. Keep things small, but don't just break them up to be as tiny as possible. Keep them focused on a single thing. Next up, a quick video on commit messages and which tense, present or past tense, you should use while writing them, and does it even matter? This is kind of a weird thing in Git. It always baffled me when I was starting out, but the Git documentation officially recommends that you use present tense imperative style commit messages. So present tense, meaning verbs like make something or change X, fix X, instead of past tense, fixed, changed, updated. So imperative style, though, or the imperative mood, is best illustrated probably by the quote from the documentation. Describe your changes in imperative mood. Make Zizzy do frauds instead of makes Zizzy do frauds, or I changed Zizzy to do frauds. Write things as if you're giving orders to the codebase to change its behavior. Personally, I always found this weird. I still do. Even if I follow this a lot of the time, it just doesn't seem natural to me. You don't have to do this, of course. This is all just convention, just a practice you can get in the habit of. There's a lot of debate over this, but again, this is sort of the official recommendation from the Git docs. Here's a blog post written by Umir Gaspar, where he talks about the 2, well, I guess there's more than 2 options, but the 2 common options using the present tense or the past tense. And the present tense, as we've already talked about, is what Git recommends. And one of the main reasons people use it is that Git actually generates its own messages at some point. When we talk about merging, it will generate a commit message that looks like this: merge pull request, blah, blah, blah. So it says merge in present tense. But honestly, in my opinion, I kind of feel like past tense makes more sense to me, because you're making a commit with the work that you have done. It's finished, you're committing it. But honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter as long as you are consistent, or more importantly, as long as you're following the pattern set out by whatever organization you're working with. If it's a company or an open source project, if everyone else is doing present tense and they ask you to do present tense, you should do present tense. So I try and stick with present tense when I'm teaching. If we type git log, the commit messages I have been writing are, split X or rename or create or begin. So those are present tense imperative, but the community is somewhat split on this. If you look at this popular Stack Overflow post from 10 years ago, the top answer says you definitely should use present tense, but then the second answer says you should almost always use the past tense. So that's number 1 and number 2 directly in conflict. Anyway, this video is going on longer than it needs to. I just wanted to make that point that in the real world, you'll likely come across present tense imperative commit messages. And as I mentioned, you don't have to follow this pattern, especially in your own personal use. But if you're working at a company or on an open source project, definitely pay attention to the guidelines for writing commit messages. So if you recall, when I first introduced git commit, I said that you could use this command, git commit, on its own, but I recommended against it for the time being because it will open up the default editor, and that default editor is likely to be Vim, which I'll just demonstrate very quickly so you can see what that experience is like. I'm going to come over to my first novel project and make a very simple change. I don't think I have any changes at this moment, but I see a typo right here in my outline. So I'm just going to fix it. Nick goes home and sees Catsby for the first time. So I'm going to save that, get status. Okay, then I'm going to do a git add outline.txt. Then I'm going to do git commit without the -m. I'm not going to pass in a message or any of that. Now let's see what happens when I hit enter. Let me full screen this so you can get a better picture of what's going on. This is called Vim. It's an editor. It's built into the terminal. It can be very confusing because I can't just start typing. It's asking me to enter a commit message, but if I try typing right now, it's actually not going to type a message. First, I have to enter what's called the insert mode by typing I. So if I just hit the letter I, now at the bottom left, can you see that here? It says insert. By the way, this really is not the time to be teaching you Vim. I'm not expecting you to learn it, but if you end up in this situation, I want you to know how to get out of it. But we're going to change our default editor. So don't worry about the actual commands. So I hit I so that I'm in insert mode, and now I can start typing and leave a commit message. So what did I do? I fixed a typo. So fix typo, just like that. All right. Fix typo in outline maybe. Sure. Now, how do I get out of here? Well, it's also confusing. First, I hit the escape key one time to leave insert mode. Next, I need to leave Vim entirely. And to do that, there's a couple of options, but I'm going to do :W and then Q. Oh gosh. So W stands for write, Q stands for quit. So this is write, basically save these changes, and quit Vim. It's very confusing. Now I'm going to hit enter. Whew. And we made that commit. And you can see fix typo in outline. If I type git log, fix typo in outline. So it looks exactly the same. It's a commit. Nothing different. It's just the way that we made it and passed in that message was a lot worse. Now, there are times where using this message flag, the -m flag, is not going to cut it. If we need to type a much longer commit message, I mean, you could cram it all into a single line, but on larger projects and large code bases, open source projects, your commit messages might actually look something like this. Multiple lines, maybe paragraphs, bullet points. So that's not going to cut it, just passing it in inside of quotes. You don't want to be typing something like that in your terminal on a single line. So we do want to configure this version, git commit, so that it opens up an editor where we actually feel comfortable typing paragraphs, where we could type something like this. And for the majority of students and the majority of developers out there, Vim is not that editor. So I like to use VS Code as my editor. I've been using it in the course, no surprise there. But you can configure Git to use really any editor. You can use VS Code or Sublime Text or any of the other editors that are out there. I'll show you how to do that right now. So if you go to the Git documentation, there's this page called Git Commands Setup and Config. It's on the appendix for the book. I'll just include a link to this if you're curious. And just like before, when we configured our username and the email address for our Git configuration, we can do the same thing for the editor. So depending on what editor you're using, there's a table here, and I'm looking for VS Code, which is right here, Visual Studio Code. And this is the command I need to type. So git config, we'll do global so that it applies to every repo, not just the current repo. Core.editor is what we're configuring, and I want it to be code, which is the name of VS Code, Visual Studio Code. And then I'll talk about this -- wait in a moment, but basically we just copy this line. So if you're using Sublime, copy this line. On a Mac, or if you're on a PC, copy this line. If you're using something else, text edit on a Mac, this is the line. But I'm going to use VS Code. So now I'll head over to my terminal. I'll paste this in here. Okay, we don't see anything change. But now let's make another commit. What could we do that won't take too much time? Okay, here's a simple one. I have some extra white space in chapter 2, just at the top. So I'm just going to get rid of that and save. And now I'll type git status. All right, it says I modified that file. All I did was delete some empty lines, but that's still a modification. So I'm going to add that. Git add chapter2.txt. Now, I would usually just use git commit -m because it's really just a simple message. We did something so simple, there's no point in typing a paragraph, right? You want to keep your commit messages as short as possible, but there are times where you need more information. This is not really one, but I'm going to do just git commit without the -m flag just to demonstrate that hopefully our editor is configured to be VS Code. Let's see. There's a problem with the editor code -- wait. So this is a problem stemming from the fact that my terminal does not know what code the command code is referring to. So it's telling me here, command not found. Basically, if I go into VS Code, I can fix that. I'm going to open the command palette, which is Command-Shift-P. And then I'm going to type code. And I want this, install code command in path. Okay, so it says shell command code successfully installed in path. So now, hopefully this works. It knows what the command code is referring to. So let's try committing again. Aha! Now it's opened up in VS Code. And you can see over here, it's waiting for me to close this file. So that's why we had to add that -- wait right here. We want it to wait until we finish editing and save our commit message. So I can type my commit in here. Also, I didn't mention this earlier, everything that starts with a hash or the octothorpe character will be ignored. It's a comment, it's not included in the commit. So in here, what did we just do? I've already forgotten. Oh, we removed white space from chapter 2. So, remove extra white space or extra lines in chapter 2 or something. Well, that kind of sounds like we actually deleted lines of chapter 2. How about extra blank lines? Sure. Okay, so now I'm going to save this file if that's the commit message I want, but I could put a lot more in here, and maybe just to demonstrate that I will, why don't I just copy one of these example commit messages that I was talking about. I'm just going to copy this entire thing over, and this is just to show you that we can do this. All right, so here's my much longer commit message. All these lines, paragraphs of text, some bullet points, they won't be formatted in any particular way. I have to do this manually, right? If I want that bullet point, it's just a dash. But anyway, this is my commit message here. Really just the first line that matters. I'm going to save. I'm going to close the file. And then over here, it now made the commit. It was waiting, and now it's not. It finished. So if I type git log, what do we see? Oh, well, we made that commit. It is here, but it's taking up so much space. That's really, really annoying. So in the next video, I'll show you how we can use git log with a small tweak so that we don't have to see the entire commit message in the case of a very long commit message. Anyway, we set up the editor. We configured it to use VS Code in this video. If you're doing something else like Sublime Text, follow the instructions here. I'll include this link in the description if you want to check it out. But you can avoid this for the most part by just using -m until you really need to type a longer commit message, which is not all that common when you're starting out. Once you start working on larger projects, though, it's definitely important to be able to open up and write messages in an editor. Okay. In this video, I want to talk about the docs one more time, and specifically how we can learn more about git log, which just gives us a log of the commits in a given repository. And as we saw, when I added a very, very long commit message, we see the entire thing here. Now, shortly, we will want to see these commits, and specifically, we're going to want to know these commit hashes. Spoiler, we need those in order to revisit a commit or undo a commit or check out or take a look at a commit. So we need those. And if we have hundreds of commits and they all have these really long messages, that could be really frustrating. So there are some options for how we use git log. So let's go to the documentation. Let's go to reference and we'll find log. Here it is. I'll zoom in a bit. As we know, it shows us commit logs. But there's quite a bit to how it works, and there's a lot that I just don't know about it because I don't use most of these features. Just like with most Git commands, there are tons of options. But the one I'm interested in for now, if we scroll down, you could also find it in the examples, I'm pretty sure, down at the bottom. I mean, look at this. This is crazy, the number of options. Just absurd. You can filter things out based on who wrote the commits, when they were committed. I believe you can order them differently. But what we are after, all right, well, I had to search for it, but this is what we're after, formatting the commits. These flags, including -- pretty, allow us to pretty print or change the format of the logs, how they're printed out. And specifically, I usually use this option one line. So -- one line, which is actually shorthand for -- pretty, equals one line -- abbrev commit. So what does this mean? We can just take one piece at a time just to show you. Abbrev commit just shows us a shorter version of that commit hash. So if I do git log -- abbrev commit, it's hard to see much of a difference. But here, I'm only getting a small piece compared to what we got before of each one of those commit hashes. But we're actually after a bit more than that. We want one line. So when we do -- pretty equals one line, we have these different options for pretty, -- pretty medium, or fuller, email. These are all things that we can format in the response. But I just wanted to show you one line. So I like to use the shorthand, -- one line. But just know that it's actually shorthand for pretty equals one line and abbreviated commit. Let me just show that, git log -- one line, if I can type it correctly. And there we go. Oh, so much better. Look at that. You can see one line of each commit message, which is why your first line of a commit message, even if it's a super long one, the first line should explain, it should summarize the commit. So remove extra blank lines. That's what we did, even though if we actually look at the entire message, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. It's very important, or I shouldn't say very important, but it's conventional, and you should follow this pattern of having that first line be the summary of the commit, and then any other information comes afterwards, separated by a return. So git log -- one line, it's a nice way to look at our history, and it's not just about, remembering, oh, that was such a cute message I wrote. It's actually important to be able to do this because shortly we will be revisiting commits and we want to look at this history so that we can figure out where to time travel back to. But for now, we're just reminiscing. So that's git log. The docs, as I just showed you, are so overwhelming. I mean, there's so much you can do with git log. I have carpal tunnel just from scrolling down this page. So don't feel intimidated, or do feel intimidated, but know that I am also intimidated by this page, whichever makes you more comfortable. Next up, totally optional, like most of this section just has to do with committing. I'm going to show you how to make a commit using a GUI, like Git Kraken. And even if you're not interested in using a GUI, I still think it's worth checking out because these GUIs can help show you your commits. They help you visualize things, but also it's nice to know that there are different ways of interacting with Git, and at the end of the day, we're still just working with that .git folder. It's just a different interface, a different way of interacting with it. So I'm using Git Kraken. I had a whole video on this early on where I talked about how to install it. It's very simple. You download it for free. And that's kind of it. And I'm just going to open up this repo that we've been working in, my first novel. So if you have any repo you've created by now, whether it's from an exercise or you're following along, you have your own novel, whatever it is, we can open it with Git Kraken. So here's Git Kraken. I'm going to go to open a new repository. So if you open it up for the first time, it will probably look like this. It will ask you to open a repository. And then here is that folder I navigated to. I'm sorry, I can't zoom in easily, but I just found my repository. So that same folder, my first novel. And I'm going to open it. And there we are. We see my commit history right here. So right now we're just visualizing the commits. This is basically what we see with a Git log. Unfortunately, it's not letting me zoom in much more either, but I hope you can see that. So we have our first one, start work on outline and main characters, all the way up to remove extra blank lines in chapter 2. But what I want to show you is how we make a new commit. So right now, our working tree is clean. I haven't made any changes. At this point, I haven't diverged from what Git has committed, as you can see. But let's make some changes. What should we do? I'm going to add some more to the characters file. So I just added some information about Myrtle Wilson. And here's some more information about George Wilson, 2 characters in The Great Gatsby that come up in chapter 2. All right, so I'm going to save that. And I'll also, how about I add something to our mood board? So I have these images in here. Let's add another image. Okay, so I downloaded 2 more images, one of alcohol and one of a billboard, thematically related in some way to The Great Gatsby. They're part of my mood board, and both also licensed for me to use. So I'm going to add those both into this mood board folder. Okay, so I've made a couple of changes, and obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but hopefully you're aware that I could check to see, my status by using git status, and I would see that we modified characters.txt, and that there are 2 new files in moodboard, which are not being tracked. But this video is about using the GUI. If we take a look at the GUI, I get this message. It says 3 file changes in working directory. So I can click here to view those file changes, or I can just click here where it says work in progress. And I wish I could make this larger, but what we see is unstaged files, characters.txt, and then moodboard bar and moodboard billboard, the 2 images. And you'll see that there's a little icon here with a pencil. That means I modified or edited that file. And here, this little plus sign means it's a new file. So I want to make a commit first. How about just with the characters changes? So I want to stage characters. So I'm going to click stage. Okay. So at this point, I have staged that 1 file. And actually, if I type git status over here, what do we see? Changes to be committed, characters.txt. So it was the same exact thing as me typing git add characters. But instead, I clicked stage. And then I'm going to make my commit. So this first commit is just characters. So I add my commit message right there, or I can type it over here. And my message will be something like add Wilson's to characters list. Okay? Or, yeah, that's fine. Add the Wilsons, maybe the Wilsons. So I added 2 of them. All right? And then I'll commit changes to that 1 file. And we see a new commit here. Add the Wilsons to character list. And if I type git status, we now made a commit. We don't have this characters.txt staged anymore. And if I type git log, there it is. Add the Wilsons to characters list. So let's do a second commit now with the mood board changes. So I'm going to stage that new bar image and the billboard image. And then I group them together by staging them, and I'll make my commit, I don't know, add more, or how about expand, add 2 images to mood board, or something like that. Nothing amazing, but here's where I write that commit message, and here's where I commit. Before I do that, what do you expect me to see when I type git status? This is what we typed, or what we saw before, 2 untracked files, but now they're both going to be committed. They are both staged because I clicked the stage button. So same process, just a different interface. I made changes. Then I click to stage and I click to commit, or I use git add to stage and git commit to commit. Alrighty, so I'm going to click commit changes to 2 files. And there we are. We have a new commit show up. And if I do git log, let's do our 1 line. There it is. Add 2 images to mood board, add the Wilsons to character list. So that's just a quick intro to using a tool like Gitkraken. Of course, the interface changes if you're using a different app like SourceTree or what else is there? Git Tower? There's a couple of them, I can't remember. They all are similar though. You click to stage and then you click to commit. You type a message in, and this is just a nice educational tool, honestly, especially when we get to branching and merging. The diagrams over here are really helpful. But at this point, it's just another way of doing what we already know how to do. Next up, amending commits. Occasionally, when you're working with Git, you may create a new commit and then realize just a moment too late that you forgot to include a relevant file in the commit. Or another thing that can happen is you make a commit and then you read over the commit message and you realize too late that you have a typo. You wrote something wrong in that commit message. So there are a couple of ways of fixing those problems, but the easiest one, the one I'm showing in this video, is to amend the commit. So this allows us to edit or to redo, to update just the previous commit. So this doesn't work if you made a mistake 10 commits ago. This is only if you made a mistake just 1 commit ago. So here's how it works. When you make a commit, here on my slides, I'm doing commit-m, I made some commit, then I realize, shoot, I forgot to include a file. So I add that file, I stage it, and then I git commit --amend. And amend is going to redo the previous commit. You can read about it on the docs, although, as always, it's a little bit intimidating. I'll search for it on here. Amend. Replace the tip of the current branch by creating a new commit. We haven't talked about branches, but creating a new commit. It's prepared as usual. The message from the original commit is used as the starting point instead of an empty message. I don't know if that's at all helpful to read. I'm just going to show it to you. So let's go ahead and make a mistake. I'm going to add a little heading to every file. So at the top, I just want it to say outline, just as an example. And then I'll add some space in there. Something like this. I'm going to do that for all my other files, chapter 1, 2, and characters. So let's do it for characters in here. So there, I have a change in this file. Here's chapter 1, or chapter 2 rather. So that's chapter 2, and then chapter 1. Okay, so I've made those changes, just added a little heading to each one of those files. If I type git status, of course we see we modified 4 files. So let's go ahead and stage some of these files. Let's do chapter 1. Let's do chapter 2. I'll make this full screen. And let's do the characters file, but I'm going to deliberately pretend to forget the outline file. So I'll add those 3 files. They should be staged. And normally I would check, like I just did with git status, and realize, oh, I forgot that file. But let's say I didn't do that, and I commit. So git commit, I'll just do a -m commit, add heading to all files, or add headings to all files. Like that. Alrighty. And then I realize, oh no, I forgot my outline. So we can use that amend option that I showed you. We need to add this file. So we're going to stage it. Again, this only works if I haven't made another commit. I can't go back and edit a commit from 10 commits ago. But I did just make that commit, and I'm going to amend it. So I'll add that file, but I'm not going to commit like normal. I'm going to do a git commit --amend. All right, and this is going to open up in VS Code, because that's what I've configured my editor to be. And it opens up the previous commit message. And this allows me to edit that commit message. So if I had a typo in here, I could change it. I could, if I misspelled. Sometimes that's the reason for amending. You might not stage any new files. You might just want to fix a commit message. Just git commit --amend. That will open up in whatever editor you've used. Hopefully you've configured it so that it's not Vim, or hopefully you know how to use Vim. So I have VS Code. Go back and watch the video where I did that if you need it. And now I can change the message if needed. But if I don't want to change the message, I want to leave it, which I do. And I just want to include that new file or files. In this case, it's just the outline. All I need to do is save this file and close it. So I'm not going to change the commit at all. You can see it's also put modified outline.txt in here. That's now going to be included. I'll close out of there. And there we are. 4 files changed is what it said in that commit. Previously, it was just 3. But now I amended that commit. I basically redid it, and I included the outline. All right, so there's 2 reasons to do this. One is to include files, changes that you forgot, that you somehow messed up in the previous commit. The other option is just to redo the commit message, or you could do both of them at the same time. You just need to add -- amend, and that allows you to redo the previous commit. When you're working on a project and you're using Git, there are often situations where you have files, directories that you just don't want Git to know about or to track at any point. You want them to be completely ignored. And there's a mechanism for doing this. We can create a particular file called .gitignore. But before we go into that, let's talk about why you might want this. One of the most common situations is if you're working on an application, you're writing code where you're using API keys, credentials, any sort of application secret that is tied potentially to a credit card, like from AWS or some API that you're using, where you don't want those to get out into the world. So you put them in a separate file. And if you push your code up to GitHub, which I realize we haven't talked about, but if you share that code and you make it public, you don't want that file to be included. So you'll still have the file yourself locally, but you don't want Git to track it. Other things include operating system files. So on a Mac, there are these pesky DS store files. They have nothing to do with your project or your code. They just show up in directories. They're system hidden files. So you don't want to track those with Git. There are similar files on Windows with a different name. Other things, log files or any files that are output by your application that could easily be generated again. So if you have an application, when you run it, it generates some report every single day, and you regenerate that report on demand. You really don't need Git to track that and save that report, because you can regenerate that report, if that makes sense. And then lastly, a really common scenario is dependencies or packages. So if you've ever worked with Node or Python or really any language, and you work with a bunch of dependencies that you download and install, those do not need to be tracked by Git. That could be hundreds or maybe thousands of different folders and files that you can easily go and get at any point. You don't need to bother tracking the dependencies themselves. So I'm going to show you an example of how we do this. As I mentioned, the mechanism is through this file with a very particular name. It's a hidden file that we create, .gitignore. And if we put that really anywhere in a repository, but traditionally we'll put it in the root of the repository, the top of it, although it doesn't have to be there. We create a file with that name. Git will look for that file. And inside of it, we can tell Git what to ignore. So we can put exact file names. So the first bullet point here is .dsstore. Git will ignore a file with that name. We can give it folder names by putting a / at the end. And we can also do fancier patterns. For example, this line here, *.log. This is a wildcard that will match anything. I think anything except for a /. It will match any character followed by the extension .log. So this allows you to tell Git, ignore all log files. I don't want to have to write them out. I don't know what their names will be. Just anything with .log. So I'll just quickly show you some examples. Again, we haven't really gone into GitHub at all, but on GitHub there are projects, and pretty much every single project here is going to have a .gitignore file. And inside, we see some of what I talked about, dsstore. We see directories like the reports directory, Node modules. If you ever work with Node, that's where all the packages are installed. So we're ignoring that. Here's another example, the app Signal, if you're familiar with that. Gitignore, there it is. And there's stuff in here, particular files and folder names. They're different because this is an Android application versus Faker I was showing you as a JavaScript app. Here's TensorFlow, another really popular open source project. Inside of here, Gitignore. right? And then we see similar stuff, but now some Python specific files and folders that they're telling Git to always ignore. So I'm going to demonstrate this. And to do this, I'm actually going to make a new repository. It doesn't really make sense to ignore things in my novel. Maybe it does, but I'm just going to make a new demo and make a simple Node application. So I'm not in a Git repository now. I'm going to make a directory. I'll just call this git ignore demo. I'll cd in there. I'll type git status. Okay, good. It's not one yet, but now I'm going to initialize git init. And I'm going to run npm init so that I can use some Node packages in here. So if you're not familiar with Node, it really doesn't matter at this point. I'm just going to install some stuff and I'm going to ignore it. But you can ignore any other files using the same stuff that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to make a file. I'll pretend to write a basic JavaScript app in here. Index.js. Maybe I'll make a secrets file as well. Secrets. I'll make it a text file. And then I open it up in my text editor. Let's put some stuff in here. So my index.js, I'm just going to write some very basic JavaScript code like console.log, hello world. All right, so whatever, this is my application code. Then I'll have some secret like API key equals, let's just say that's some secret key I don't want anyone to know about, but I need it for my app. And then let's go ahead and make our first commit. So it would be nice if I could make a commit and just do git add dot, but I can't because that will include secrets.txt. So I need to add the index first, and then I'll also add my package.json, which is a generated file from Node, and then I'll commit, start project or something. Doesn't matter what. Okay, and of course, we still have this file that's untracked, and we want it to stay that way. We don't want it to be tracked. So if I do some more work in here, I'm just gonna copy that a couple times. We'll pretend I just wrote a lot of code. Then I'm gonna head over here again to my terminal, and I need to add that change, but I can't do git add dot. I need to add just the index.js, right? And then I can commit again, add new feature. This is a horrible commit message, but pretend it's not. All right, so now I'm gonna go and install something with npm. I'll install React. I'm using npm in here, and we can see I have a new directory, Node modules, and it has React in there and some of React's dependencies. So if I type git status now, it also notices that Node modules now exists. And my secrets file is still there. There's this thing called package.lock.json. The package.json is modified, which I'm cool with. I want to track that. That's where the dependencies are listed. So it tells anybody who gets this code, I need React, but we don't actually need to track the folder that includes React. We can always go get that whenever necessary. So now let's add in our git ignore file so that this will be ignored. I'm going to make a new file. I can do it from here. I'll just do it from the command line, I guess, to be consistent. Touch.git ignore. And as I mentioned, it's conventional to put it in the root of your project directory. So now I have that file. And then in here, I can write certain files and patterns that I want to be ignored. So for example, I don't know if there's a dsstore file in here. No, there's not at the moment, but I don't know why it pops up, but sometimes it just does. So I'm saying ignore that. Please also ignore the exact file, secrets.txt. That's the name of the file. And the node modules directory. So I need a slash. If it's just node modules like this, it thinks it's a file. This tells Git it's a directory, node modules. So over here, if I type git status now, whoa, look at that. Very different. Now, we no longer see, well, I got rid of it. Unfortunately, I cleared. But earlier, it was tracking node modules and secrets. Now, we just see git ignore, because we did change that file and it exists. We want to track the git ignore file. Then also this package lock.json. And that's fine to track with Git. So now I can just do things like git add dot if I wanted to. And I can commit. and then I can make some commit message. In this case, it doesn't really matter. I haven't done any work, but I'll just say, add gitignore file. And now anytime I make changes in those files, if I change my secrets file right there, I'll do something else in here. Let's just add on to that key. I save. Normally Git would notice, but now it says nothing. It's ignoring this file entirely. So there's a lot to writing gitignores, especially for complicated projects. You can have all sorts of stuff in there. And to help out, there are tools online. I'll show you one quickly. This is on the GitHub documentation. They recommend this one site, gitignore.io, where you can specify what you're working in. For example, if you're working on a Python app, this is a recommended starting place for gitignore. And you may not have files with all of these patterns or these extensions or these directory names, but they're common enough that you can just include it. It's really not adding a lot of overhead to your application. And they have similar gitignore templates for JavaScript and pretty much any other thing you can think of. So that's an intro to gitignore files. There's a lot to them, right? The patterns you can write, you can actually go on the Git docs and read about it. There's more that we didn't even go into. For example, 2 stars is different from 1 star. A question mark is a way to match a single character. If you're familiar with regular expressions notation, it's kind of similar here. But anyway, most of the time, it's good enough to just be able to ignore file names, directories, and file extensions using the wildcard. Okay, so that's gitignore.